Hello, everybody. I'm Toby Mueller, the moderator of this conference on violence, and thanks again for having me. You'll have to be seeing quite a bit of me until tomorrow night, I'm afraid. So this morning I said that the format will be pretty much the same all through the conference, except for the closing discussion tomorrow night. That was the first mistake I think I made, because the next performance, lecture, talk will be quite different in that respect, as you will see in quite a moment. I'll tell you more about that after I will have introduced our next guest, our next speaker. I hope you had a good lunch, and I hope your stomach is stable, because our subject now is going to get gory, so to speak, and I do not mean that all that metaphorically. Our next speaker actually coined the term Gore Capitalism, with a book of the same title, conjuring up images of horror and splatter. And who could say this were far-fetched in the new landscapes of war, how she calls it? Our speaker is an activist intellectual in the transfeminist from Tijuana, Mexico, a famous border town. And this will play a role in her talk. We will hear the beginning of this essay that I'm quoting MIT Press now, quote, that posits a decolonial feminist philosophical approach to the outbreak of violence in Mexico and more broadly across the global regions in the third world. She uses that term on purpose. Maybe we can explore on why in our conversation afterwards. She argues that violence itself has become a product within hyper-consumerist neoliberal capitalism, and that tortured and mutilated bodies have become commodities to be traded and utilized for profit in an age of impunity and governmental austerity, quote end. So our guest is not going to read her talk herself, but has brought a recording read by the translator of her book, Gore Capitalism, called John Plucker. For the conversation afterwards, we will have a whispering translation by Kai Kempe, and after the recording of the talk, she will be present here on stage. She will show you some pictures that will clarify more of her concept of Gore Capitalism. Then we'll have the conversation, the three of us with the translator here on stage, and then it's your turn. So this is going to be same as this morning, I guess. Now I'm very pleased to introduce her, that she has made the long journey from Tijuana here to us in Frankfurt. Please welcome Sayak Valencia.
Gore Capitalism. We propose the term Gore Capitalism to refer to the reinterpretation of the hegemonic global economy in geographic border spaces. As an example of this phenomenon, we propose the city of Tijuana, located at the border between Mexico and the United States, and known as the far corner of Latin America. We take the term gore from a genre of films characterized by extreme, brutal violence. Thus, Gore Capitalism refers to the undisguised and unjustified bloodshed that is the price the third world pays for adhering to the increasingly demanding logic of capitalism. It also refers to the many instances of dismembering and disembowelment, often tied up with organized crime, gender, and the predatory uses of bodies. In general, this term posits these incredibly brutal kinds of violence as tools of necroempower-ment. Bodies are here conceived of as products of exchange that alter and break capital's logics of production, subverting the terms of capital by substituting commodity production with a commodity made flesh in the body and human life, through predatory techniques of extreme violence, like kidnapping and contract murder. Thus, when we say Gore Capitalism, we refer to the disruption of values and practices taking place most visibly in border territories, where one must ask, quote, what converging types of strategies are being developed by subalterns, the marginalized, under the transnationalizing forces of the first world, end quote. Unfortunately, many of the strategies for confronting the first world are ultra-violent forms of capital accumulation, practices that we characterize as gore. To further clarify this term, whereas in the first volume of Capital, Marx writes that quote, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense accumulation of commodities, end quote. In Gore Capitalism, this process is redirected, and the destruction of the body becomes in itself the product or commodity. The only kind of accumulation possible now is through a body count, as death has become the most profitable business in existence. We do not seek purity, correctness, or incorrectness in the application of the logic of capitalism and its intended and unintended consequences. We do not seek to make value judgments, but rather to provide evidence of the failure of neoliberal discourse to explain said phenomena. Contemporary approaches are insufficient to theorize the Gore practices that are now found around the world. This fact shows the need for such theorization in a world in which there is no space outside capitalism's reach. Not conceptualizing Gore practices does not do away with them, but merely renders them invisible or discusses them using language that creates a double standard inside of a theory, where terms like black market refer to economic practices specific to the third world, since they are already considered illegal. We're interested in developing a discourse with the explanatory power to help us interpret the reality produced by Gore capitalism, found in violence, drug trafficking, and necropower, while at the same time presenting the dystopias of globalization and its imposition. We are also interested in following the multiple threads that give rise to the capitalist practices underpinned by extreme and ultra-specialized forms of violence, practices that in certain geopolitical locales have become established as everyday forms of violence used to obtain recognition and economic legitimacy. The raw nature of this violence obeys a logic born out of structures and processes planned in the very heart of neoliberalism, globalization, and politics. We are talking about practices that are transgressive solely because their forcefulness makes the vulnerability of the human body clear in how it is mutilated and desecrated. These practices constitute a scathing critique of the society of hyperconsumption, at the same time as they participate in it and in capitalism's inner workings, since, quote, in many nations, organized crime has become a key political actor and an interest group, a player that must be taken into consideration by the legitimate political system. This criminal element frequently provides necessary foreign currency, jobs, and the economic well-being essential for national stability, as well as the enrichment of those who hold political power, through at times corrupt means, especially in poor countries, end quote. These practices have reached ever more shocking extremes with the advent of globalization, and it is founded on predatory logics that, along with spectralization and speculation in financial markets, foment and implement radically violent practices. In the words of Thomas Friedman, former special advisor to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright during the Clinton administration, quote, for globalization to work, America can't be afraid to act like the almighty superpower that it is. The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the designer of the F-15, and the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technology is called the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, end quote. Mary Louise Pratt further discusses globalization as a false protagonist. Quote, the term globalization eliminates understanding, even the desire for understanding. In this sense, globalization functions at times as a kind of false protagonist, which impedes a sharper interrogation of the processes that have been reorganizing practices and meanings during the last 25 years, end quote. If we draw on this analysis, we could say that what we are designating here as Gore Capitalism is one of the processes of globalization, its B-side, unmasking the extent of its consequences. For this reason, we do not deny the complexity of the phenomenon, and will inquire into the array of consequences that exceed the interpretive regime that undergirds capitalist monopoly. In the same sense, given the existence of movements, discourses, and resistance activities that seek to confront the reach of capitalist discourse, we think it is vital to clarify that our reflections on Gore capitalism do not share the assumptions of, nor are they limited to, capitalist discursive practices. We propose Gore capitalism then as a heteroclite space that has not been sufficiently theorized within these alternatives to capitalism, which understand Gore capitalism as strongly rooted in capitalist logic, and so relegated to the realm of the irrational, labeling it undesirable and dystopian. In a similar way, the process of Gore capitalism is rendered invisible by the discourse of the official capitalist economy and neglected within its system of thought. It is not considered especially significant or complex, despite its noteworthy explicatory functions, but rather it is delegated to consideration only as part of the black market and its effects on capital. However, now that the criminal economy is estimated to make up no less than 15% of global commerce, the effects of Gore capitalism on the world economy is evident. These numbers bestow it with real power in terms of planetary economic decisions. The urgency of devising a critical discourse that describes Gore capitalism derives in part from the need to have a common language with which to discuss the phenomenon, for it is well known that, quote, the world reveals itself in language, and social relations are elaborated within language, end quote. As language is a core element in the epistemological organization of the world, we think it is vital to investigate, review, reason through, and attempt to propose an explanatory discourse that might provide us with a conceptual frame to think through, analyze, and approach these spaces, fields, and their practices. We also think it is essential to name these spaces, fields, and their practices from a transfeminist perspective, by which we mean a network that opens discursive spaces and fields to all those contemporary practices and subjects that have not been directly analyzed. We are especially concerned with the lack of explanatory language for the phenomena we identify here with the term Gore capitalism. We cannot ignore the relationships between legal and illegal economies and the rampant use of violence as a mode of capitalist necroempower-ment and wealth accumulation. If we were to do so, we would neutralize the possibility of action against them and obscure the fact that these processes regularly impact the bodies of all those who are part of the minority becoming, upon whom, one way or another, all of this brutal violence falls. Thus, we propose an analysis of Gore capitalism, understood as, quote, the systematically uncontrolled and contradictory dimension of the neoliberal project, end quote. It is a product of economic polarization, the excesses of information advertising that create and support a hyper-consumerist identity and its counterpart, the ever-shrinking numbers of people with the financial power to satisfy their consumer desires. This process creates radical capitalist subjects we term endriago subjects, and new discursive figures that make up an episteme of violence, as well as reconfigures the concept of work through a perverse sense of agency, now rooted in the necropolitical commercialization of murder. All of this is evidence of the dystopias produced through an unconsidered adherence to pacts with masculinist neoliberalism and its objectives. Endriago subjectivities are created in the face of this world order, as individuals seek to establish themselves as valid subjects with the possibility of belonging and ascending within society. These subjects create new fields out of one of the most ferocious, devastating, and irreversible processes of capitalist investment. They contradict the logic of what is acceptable and normative because of their new awareness that they have become redundant in the economic order. These subjects confront their situation and their context by means of necroempower-ment and the fugitive, dystopian necro-practices of Gore, as they convert this process into the only possible reality and attempt to legitimate the processes of underground economies, black market, drug trafficking, weapons, bodies, etc., through their reign of violence. These actions both create and reinterpret new fields apart from the valid ones, and thereby wield influence over political, public, official, social, and cultural processes. As Pratt affirms, quote, once we live in a world of bandits and pirates, now in the form of coyotes and polleros, drug traffickers, hitmen, kidnappers, etc., who work on the borders of the whole planet, end quote. It is no accident that drug trafficking is currently the largest industry in the world, followed by the legal economies of fossil fuels and tourism, that drug money flows freely through the arteries of global financial systems, or that drug trafficking is itself one of the clearest examples of Gore capitalism. It is clear that, quote, this is not the scene we imagined for the beginning of the new millennium, end quote, but it is the one we are faced with. It is our philosophical responsibility to analyze it in order to expose the weakness and inflexibility of discourses of globalization and neoliberalism, which are unable to explain these processes. Contemporary history is no longer written from the perspective of the survivors, but rather through the number of dead. That is, the litany of cadavers has been an answer to the clearly utopian character of the official discourses about globalization, subverting the optimistic discourse of flow brought on by globalization, since now what flows freely is not people, but drugs, violence, and the capital these produce. This represents an inversion of terms, whereby life is no longer valued in and of itself, but only as an object of monetary exchange in the market, a transvaluation whereby the only measure of value is the ability to mete out death to others. Necropower is exercised from unexpected quarters for the benefit of official power holders. The explosion of unrestrained and hyper-specialized violence is evidence of the lack of any regulatable future, along with the fact that in capitalism's interstices, no one has anything to lose because life is no longer important, which means the taboo against killing has been entirely undone. Violence continually iterated in the here and now makes it impossible to contemplate the idea of the future in the ways the West has customarily done. The violence demands a reassessment of futurity itself. Driven by capitalism's interpretive monopoly, ignorance and contempt for the third world have taught us to see other elements and historical dynamics, those of the others, as insignificant. Neglect and contempt have provoked a response born of silence and invisibility that seems at once unstoppable and unfathomably violent. The result is a process of capitalism's deformed duplication, an unfolding of parallel identities in places, spaces, and subjects that incorporate, retranslate, and fuse together these experiences into something simultaneous, emancipatory, and fragmentary. We thus see that, quote, the incapacity of neoliberalism to generate belonging, collectivity, and a believable sense of the future produces, among other things, enormous crises of existence and of meanings that are being lived by the non-consumerists and consumerists of the world, informs that the neoliberal ideology can neither predict nor control. End quote. It is precisely in this space where we encounter the relevance and importance of thinking about Gore capitalism.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for your patience, and it's for me it's really important to make this translation because it seems like I'm from the border, so it reflects the difference between the male, white, correct pronunciation, masculine accent from the north in the United States, but it's my translator. It's also border boy, but at the other side of the border. So it's for me also an exercise to make keep attention in the voice, because we don't listen that much. We just see things, and we need to listen and to take time to listen. So I do it because that, and also because I like to make performs, but also to begin again, I want to thanks for the invitation to the museum, to Suzanne, to Pascal, to Evelyn and Anna and Laura, that it makes happen these things together. So thank you very much for the whole huge work that you do, and because the things doesn't made itself, yeah, you have to do it. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm gonna show you some images about the border, the north border of Tijuana, San Diego, but also Gore Capitalism is really a reflection about the link between colonialism, masculinity, drug trafficking, and also violence against women and other populations that becoming minorities, migrants, and other persons, but also the idea of narco culture is like this is representation of these cowboys, Mexican persons with weed and arms and big vehicles like and it's a kind of representation, a really colonial representation of the other. It's they have to be the other, they have to be savages, and they have to be monsters to be understandable as Mexicans, violent persons, to make invisible the responsibility of the global market and the influence of the illegal economy in the legal economy. So I put it here, and I think this is a better image to understand what it means, Gore Capitalism. I don't want to put any more blood on the images because there is a lot of them, and all the time we just thought about violence in Mexico. It's people dismembering people fighting each other, and it's about the whole thing. It's about money, and it is a border, economic border place. So I want to present the border, Tijuana border, that I'm really sure that you saw it before and other presentations, but also in many other presentations, but I want to show you that this really dystopian place, it seems like a regular place with a huge, fantastic weather and a huge sunny light, but it's there is the border between this way is Mexico, the front is Mexico, and the other part you can see there is San Diego, it's the United States, and it's if you see there is this new border, but it's also three new. They are three walls, and that's because when Donald Trump said that he wants to make again. A new border or new wall for us is not meaningless because we already have three, and the border is not just about migration; it's about other stuff that maybe we can discuss when in the question and answers take place. This is image. It's really recent image. They don't have this the part of the up of the wall. That is new, and they put it because the Honduran migrant caravan. And also, this is many interventions of people who are trying to cross the border, or also who are deported, and there is this is a migrant, and this the white image is a Mexico map, and also the señalization of the limits between Mexico and the United States. Is there is an inscription and said "Aquí empieza la patria." That's the nationalist Mexican state begins here. And also, I just put this one because it's it looks really happy, colorful, sunny day. But also, you can see the helicopters all the time to just crossing and watching in the border. So it's a kind of contradictory image. And also you can see that there is United States. You can see through the wall, and there is a border patrol cops, and they are all day over there. And but also we make a daily life in this gory context. We make a daily life like even the dystopia wasn't there. And I want to show you some real images from the border, not just dead ones or killing each other, just other ways to organize the daily life in the border. And then the last one is San Isidro port entry. This is a new barricade. They made it because the Honduran caravan wants to cross, and they put all this in that day the army of the United States was in front of that barricade, and it seems like normal, but it's really dangerous stuff that is happening right now in the border, because necropolitics is the way the border north. The north is making the border as a dispositive to make a genocide against some population and don't pay responsibility for that. And well, this is another one, and this I like to show it because right there you can see that image, the wall enter into the sea, but you can see that there is we have to see with distance this border, because everybody and in the image of the border is just really close and doesn't permit to understand that the function of that border more than a global way, not just a simplified structure of governmentability, that it's who is dystopian and violent and bloodshed, but it's also kind of the global cartography of the financial markets and also the illegal markets. So I will let it here, and we have a conversation with Toby, and we will have a translator, because I feel more comfortable in Spanish, talking in Spanish, and bueno.
Thank you so much for that presentation performance, Sayak, and those impressive images we just saw. We have about 25 minutes, roughly half an hour up here. And for you, I have a couple of questions to start this conversation out with. And actually, I would like, with the preface of the book, prior to the introduction of which we heard something now that is written in a totally different style. It's more like a poem. And if you're okay with that, I'd like to read that with my non-existent Spanish, but I hope I'll cope. And it begins like this, I quote, "Esto es queer land, aquí empieza la patria. The homeland begins here," quote end, "Esto es Tijuana. At the brink of El Bordo, I become Blade. Tijuana is affectionate, unfathomable, full of possibilities, to be in love with a psychopath and to say so with a smile. You should leave now. This is Tijuana." That's the preface to Gore Capitalism, right at the beginning. And I was wondering if you could tell us something about the possibilities you see there, the possibilities you reference in that preface, about agency in Gore Capitalism. What is agency in Gore Capitalism? What can you do about it, in other words? This is something I read into the preface, and I'm wondering if I'm right or not.
Sí, buenas tardes. Voy a hablar en español. Tenemos el traductor. Creo que también es importante que me escuchen hablar así, porque así es como escribo y así es como pienso. Y la traducción también es una especie como de ventriloquía. El prefacio, como tú lo denominas, es un poema que se llama Esto es Tijuana, y mi idea sobre el capitalismo Gore empieza con ese poema. Creo que debemos... ¿No? ¿Sí? Vale.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you once again, and I would like to continue speaking in my mother tongue in Spanish. I think it's very important that all of you hear me speaking in Spanish, because that's the way that I wrote the book, that's the language I wrote the book, and language is what this is all about at the end of the day. The introduction that you just mentioned is a poem, and there's a special reason why I picked that poem to start my book about Gore Capitalism.
Lo escribí, un poema que escribí después de encontrar un cuerpo descuartizado mientras iba transitando por la calle, y donde me di cuenta de que la violencia en Tijuana era responsabilidad mía y del Estado, y bueno, que la violencia implicaba a muchas personas y que no podíamos seguirla pensando como algo que pasaba de unas personas contra otras, de los criminales contra otros criminales, sino que era un ecosistema en el que nos mantenían para gobernarnos, ¿no?
And the reason why I chose, or I came up with this poem in the introduction was that once when I went for a walk, I found a dismembered body And at that moment, I realized that the responsibility of the killings and of the violence was not only laying with other people, with other players, with criminals or politics, but that it was also my shared responsibility because I was living in the same political ecosystem.
El concepto de agencia dentro del poema, o la idea de agencia que tiene Occidente, es salir de un espacio de subalternización, como de alguna manera ascender de la precariedad, pero el agenciamiento que yo estoy planteando en el capitalismo Gore es aquel agenciamiento que toman las personas subalternizadas a través del ejercicio de la violencia y le dan la vuelta a las lógicas de ese mismo agenciamiento. Yo a eso le denomino necroempoderamiento, y esa lógica de necroempoderamiento está muy vinculada con la lógica de los emprendedores económicos.
You asked about agency, and I want to speak out for all the people that are suppressed and also affected by the violence. I want to give them a voice in a way, and also show how everybody is linked in that necro-empowerment situation, how some are victims and some others are actors.
Quizá agregar que, voy a repetir, que la lógica del necroempoderamiento basa su lógica del asesinato y como un trabajo de la lógica del emprendedurismo.
And also to add that the logic of necroempowerment bases its decisions of decision making of killing, of violence. It's based on a capitalist and entrepreneurial scheme.
Do you have another question?
Yeah. I do. Let's just try to delve a little deeper into the concept of Gore Capitalism, and maybe stick to the first question just for one moment more, and ask you if I got that right now. You stressed the complicity of yours, into Gore Capitalism. You were sort of part of that. That's what you mentioned when finding that dismembered body. But in the poem, you also speak of the possibilities, that is full of possibilities. So could you give us an example of a possibility to sort of lose that complicity, or to reduce that complicity, or to do something about it? Is there, like in terms of activism, what would you propose, and give us a little bit more detail about maybe?
Mi propuesta es, ante el necroempoderamiento y ante la violencia generalizada, primero impugnar la lógica estatal de que la violencia era todo lo que había en México, que es todo lo que hay, porque es una narrativa estatal para controlarnos y quitarnos derecho. Y mi propuesta es hacer, con Capitalismo Gore, lo que quiero hacer es hacer una crítica decolonial a la historia colonial de nuestro país, que se sigue repitiendo a través justamente de abrazar las lógicas del neoliberalismo, del exitismo y del progreso, que son las lógicas de Occidente, y decir que de alguna manera tenemos que desengancharnos de eso, y que la gente que está siendo responsable o creando comunidad desde un lugar que no es violento somos más personas que las que sí están haciéndolo. Creo que la perspectiva feminista en este sentido, la perspectiva decolonial y la vuelta un poco del discurso y de la historia a decir que nos tenemos que hacer cargo de este proyecto de gobernamentalidad de la modernidad colonial que sigue viviendo en las fronteras.
Well, my suggestion is that we reject that feeling of that we are victims of violence, that violence is only what takes place south of the border in Mexico, that we are a people that is inherently violent. I do believe that that I try to bring forward a criticism of colonialism, and to show that our country has been made to take on the burden of neoliberalism, and we are forced to advance according to the the supporting arguments of neoliberalism, of colonialism, and I also think that the viewpoint of feminism and decolonialism is something that we have to embrace and take charge of in order to reject that point of view that we are a inherently violent people.
Okay. Let me try to broaden the scope on one side and then focus it a little more on the other. And I'm trying to do that with a term that keeps reappearing in your book, and we've heard it today also. The term is hyper-consumerism. I mentioned it already in the introduction. It played a certain role in your talk, and this is something I find so interesting precisely because we have known that term for so long, and we have known for so long what this problem leads to, let's say endless growth. I mean, we've been warned about this in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s with the Club of Rome, and yet I still think it's hard to address that problem somehow. I mean, there's no political party, at least in this country, who would address something like hyper-consumerism or degrowth. You instantly lose any election if you do that. I mean, we know that from the Green Party. If you say you have to eat vegetables once in a week, you're just off the stage. I mean, you're booed away. I mean, you just cannot do that. It's very hard to do it, but we all know what hyper-consumerism leads to, and many things we've heard about today, like surveillance even. I mean, there's like endless growth means also endless traffic, right? If you have endless traffic in the internet, there's endless surveillance, endless drug trafficking. So what to do? I mean, would this actually mean to counter that sort of hyper-consumerism you see at the heart of the problem? Also, would that lead necessarily to a aesthetic of asceticism, Askese in Deutsch? I mean, that's a very unpopular thing to say. I know that. I mean, it would mean not do any cocaine. It would mean travel less. It would mean buying less. It would mean consuming less. As it's you know, the term says it already, hyper-consumerism. Would you advocate, in the end, that would be the simple question, an aesthetic of asceticism?
Para mí el concepto de hiperconsumo no solamente es una práctica igual que la de trabajo, ya es una forma de producción de subjetividad. La gente, primero desmantelaron la idea de solidaridad a través de la clase social, desmantelaron la idea de que la pobreza, esencializaron la pobreza diciendo que la gente es pobre y no que es una clase social donde se puede prestar la solidaridad. Creo que primero podemos decir eso. Como, otra vez, que el hiperconsumo o hiperconsumerismo no es solamente un concepto que tenga que ver con consumir, sino que produce un tipo de subjetividad. Y sobre todo produce un tipo de subjetividad que impacta a la gente que no puede consumir. No solamente tienen que consumir un poco, sino que tienen que hiperconsumir. En Europa parece que no hiperconsumen, pero la cosa es que aquí cualquier cosa de consumo normal cuesta 5 veces lo que podría costarnos a nosotros en nuestro contexto latinoamericano. Entonces, ser un consumidor en Europa es ser un consumidor de ese tipo en Latinoamérica sería ser un hiperconsumidor. La gente está destinada más bien al infraconsumo por la escasez y por la degradación económica. Entonces, lo que quieren es parecerse al consumo de aquí, pero en ese lugar se vuelve un hiperconsumo.
Hyperconsumerism, in my view, produces a notion of subjectivity, which is dismantling of the self-consciousness of lower class, of poor people. Here in Europe, as an example, whatever you buy, you will pay around 5 times as much as for the product as you would pay for in Latin America. And I think that trying to get the poorer people to always want more and live up to the expectations of hyperconsumerism is the root of the problem.
Y tengo una cosa más que apuntar. El hiperconsumo o la subjetividad de hiperconsumo es la subjetividad que imita el éxito a la subjetividad de tipo ganador y una subjetividad que blanquea de alguna manera y que te quita el estigma en el tercer mundo de ser una persona racializada. El dinero blanquea y la pobreza oscurece. Entonces el hiperconsumo se vuelve una forma de exorcizar también esa parte colonial.
I also think, just to add, that hyperconsumerism is a way to exonerate poor people from their stigma of being poor, because the more they achieve, the more they win according to the laws of capitalism, the freer they are of their stigma of poverty. And so it's easy to say that, and easy to see that money kind of whitens your appearance, and poverty makes you fall back.
Kind of. Yeah, it's good. I want to translate it because it's kind of difficult, really difficult to translate myself in the end, and that's why. But it's also, I want to just put something and pin something that I'm not criminalize the poor people, and I even don't think there's a poor people. There is a class that calls class work people, but it's a poorness is not an essential of the bodies or the persons, as and are structures of empowerment or impoverishment of the persons, but not the person itself are poor. So just because I don't want to criminalize that populations, and then also because the class, the idea of the class in the Marxist way is really important to think about again, because in this context that the work is almost a commodity, you know, that you have a job, you have a commodity, we have to think again about the work and the relation with gender. And in the center of the Gore Capitalism, my critique was the masculinity has a cartography, not as a body, sex body, but it's a cartography of the design of the state that retroduced the national state to the Mexican bodies of male and make this governance against all populations with the necromasculinity or masculinity who kills to control people, territories, and other stuff. But also that kind of masculinity is linked with the other masculinity, this national state, European, white, and progressive state. So we are monsters because you are humans, almost like that. And we have to maintain that appearance of monsters to put it, the national state of European and whiteness has democratic and valuable and humanistic and everything. You know, it's a kind of more difficult than that, but I want to put it that this and that really not maybe brilliant or consider terms, but it's about the new fight or the fight in the border, about the intermittency of the colonialism and the laboratory of colonialism that it situates in the border, and it's related with the economic, legal and illegal.